the chilling silence of a New York City penthouse, where money flowed like water and secrets were buried under layers of marble and silk, a perfect life was about to shatter. Catherine Sterling, 7 months pregnant, and glowing with a joy she believed was real, stood at the top of a grand spiraling staircase. Her millionaire husband, Richard, the man who had promised her the world, stood behind her, his voice a venomous whisper. Below, in the shadows of the foyer, stood his mistress, Vanessa. Her arms crossed a smirk, playing on her lips. What happened next wasn't an accident. It was an execution. And as the paramedics wheeled Catherine's broken body away, the mistress watched, believing her victory was complete. But she and the police who arrived moments later had no idea who they were truly dealing with. The Sterling penthouse on Park Avenue was less a home and more a museum of a life Catherine felt she was merely curating. It was a space of cavernous rooms with ceilings so high they seemed to swallow sound, where Italian marble floors were so polished she could see her distorted reflection staring back up at her. Every piece of furniture, every abstract painting, every crystal vase had been chosen not by her, but by Richard Sterling, the man she had married just under 2 years ago. He called it our home, but Catherine often felt like the most expensive and most controlled acquisition within it. Richard was a titan of finance, a man whose picture often graced the pages of business magazines with headlines that spoke of his ruthless genius. To the world he was charismatic, impossibly handsome and generous. He had swept Catherine, then a junior art gallery curator, with a modest apartment and a love for impressionism off her feet, with a whirlwind romance that felt like a fairy tale. He'd showered her with gifts, whisked her away to Paris on a private jet, and proposed under the Eiffel Tower. She had fallen hard and fast for the man he presented to the world. The reality of their marriage, however, was a slow, creeping chill. Richard's affection came with conditions. Her friends, like her fiercely loyal college roommate, Jessica Riley, were deemed unsuitable for the Sterling social circle. Her passion for her job was dismissed as a quaint little hobby, until he gently but firmly persuaded her to quit after they were married. "A Sterling wife doesn't work, my love," he had said, framing it as an act of devotion. "Your job is to be my beautiful Catherine." Lately his control had tightened into a vice. He monitored her credit card statements, questioning every purchase. He installed a new state-of-the-art security system that he had sole control over, effectively making her a prisoner in her own opulent home. Phone calls to her family became stilted affairs with Richard, often lingering in the room, his presence a silent warning to keep things light and positive. "He's isolating you, Kate," Jessica had warned her over a rare lunch outing a month prior, one Catherine had to orchestrate with the precision of a military operation. "This isn't protection, it's possession." Catherine had defended him, a reflex she was beginning to hate. "He's just protective, Jess. He's had security threats before. You don't understand his world?" But she was starting to, and the most terrifying part of his world had a name: Vanessa Croft. Vanessa was Richard's protégée at his firm, a woman with raven black hair, eyes as sharp and cold as obsidian, and an ambition that radiated from her like heat. Catherine had met her at a few company galas. Vanessa was everything Catherine wasn't: sleek, predatory, and utterly at home in the cutthroat world Richard inhabited. She would touch his arm when she spoke to him, her fingers lingering just a second too long. She would look at Catherine, not with jealousy, but with a cold, dismissive pity, as if she were looking at a placeholder, a temporary occupant of a role she herself was destined to fill. The late-night board meetings had become more frequent. Richard would come home smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, a sharp jasmine scent that clung to the fibers of his custom-tailored suits. When she'd confronted him, her voice trembling, he had laughed it off. "Darling, you're pregnant and hormonal," he'd said, his smile never reaching his eyes. "Vanessa is a crucial part of my team. Are you accusing me of infidelity after everything I've given you?" He had a way of turning her valid fears into accusations of her own ingratitude, leaving her feeling small and foolish. But the discovery of the second phone tucked away in his gym bag had shattered her last vestiges of denial. The screen lit up with a message from V. He can't wait to be rid of her. The prenup is the only thing stopping him. But not for long. The prenuptial agreement. Catherine had barely glanced at it, so blinded by love and trust. Her lawyer had urged caution, but Richard had been so persuasive, framing it as a mere formality to protect his business interests for their future children. Now the memory of his words chilled her to the bone. She had retrieved the document from their safe, her hands shaking. The clauses were ironclad. In the event of a divorce, initiated before the birth of their first child, she would walk away with a paltry, insulting sum. However, if a child was born of the marriage, a trust would be established, and her settlement would be in the tens of millions. Her baby. Their son, who was currently kicking gently against her ribs, was not a symbol of their love to Richard. He was a financial liability, a multi-million-dollar problem. That evening, the air in the penthouse was thick with unspoken tension. Richard was hosting a small, impromptu gathering for some investors. He had insisted she wear a tight silk sheath dress, one that she felt was unflattering to her 7-month bump, but he had waved away her discomfort. "I want to show off my 2 most precious assets." He'd purred, one hand on her belly, the other on her back. The touch felt like a brand. During the party, she saw Vanessa arrive uninvited. She glided into the room, a vision in crimson, and made a beeline for Richard. Catherine watched them from across the room, a knot of ice forming in her stomach. She saw the shared glances, the conspiratorial whispers. At one point, Vanessa's eyes met hers across the crowded living area, and the woman offered a slow, deliberate smile. It was a victor's smile. When the last guest had departed, the silence that descended was heavier than any sound. The staff had been dismissed for the night. It was just the 3 of them. Vanessa stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the glittering city, a glass of champagne in her hand, the very picture of arrogance. Catherine knew she couldn't live this lie another moment. Her baby's life and her own depended on her courage. "Richard," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "We need to talk." He turned from the bar, his expression one of weary indulgence. "Catherine, it's been a long night. I know about the phone, Richard. I know about Vanessa." The mask of the charming husband dropped, replaced by a cold, flat emptiness that terrified her. He didn't deny it. He didn't even try. He simply looked at her, as if she were a piece of furniture he was tired of. "So you've been snooping," he said, his voice dangerously low. "How disappointing. I want a divorce." Catherine said the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. She clutched her belly, a primal need to protect her son washing over her. Richard laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the vast room. "A divorce? Don't be stupid, Catherine. You'll get nothing. You'll be back in your tiny apartment with nothing to show for your time as Mrs. Sterling. Read your prenup." "I have," she shot back, a spark of defiance flaring within her. "And I know that changes once our son is born." That was her mistake. The moment the words left her lips, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. A dark, chilling clarity. He glanced over at Vanessa, who had been watching the entire exchange with detached amusement. Vanessa gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confirmation. A green light. "You're right," Richard said, his voice suddenly soft, almost gentle, as he started walking towards her. "Things do change. We can't have that, can we?" He backed her towards the top of the grand staircase, the centerpiece of their magnificent cold home. The staircase was his pride and joy, a sweeping structure of polished mahogany and gleaming steel that spiraled down 3 floors. "Richard, what are you doing?" she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step back, her heel catching the edge of the top step. He was in front of her now, his face a mask of cold resolve. "Just fixing a problem, my love," he said. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his grip like iron. She looked past him, her eyes locking with Vanessa's in the foyer below. The smirk was gone, replaced by an expression of eager, hungry anticipation. Vanessa raised her champagne flute in a silent, mocking toast. In that horrifying, crystal-clear moment, Catherine understood everything. This wasn't just about a divorce. This wasn't just about money. This was an eradication. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Please not the baby." Richard's smile was the last thing she saw. He was the whole point, Catherine. And then he pushed. The world became a nauseating, terrifying blur of motion. For a split second, there was weightlessness, a horrifying void where the solid floor had been. Then gravity took hold, with brutal force. Catherine's shriek was swallowed by the cavernous space as her body tumbled down the mercilessly hard mahogany steps. Each impact was a starburst of agony. Her head struck a baluster, the crack sickeningly loud in the silent penthouse. Her shoulder slammed into a step, her arm twisting at an unnatural angle. Her last conscious thought was a desperate silent prayer for her son, as a final crushing impact against the marble floor below stole her breath and plunged her into an abyss of blackness. Down in the foyer, Vanessa Croft didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her champagne, her dark eyes fixed on the crumpled form at the bottom of the stairs. The sight of Catherine's still body, a halo of dark hair spread out on the white marble, didn't evoke an ounce of pity. It was the satisfying conclusion to a well-executed plan. This was her prize. The man, the fortune, the life. She had won. Above, Richard Sterling stood at the top of the stairs, his breathing slightly ragged, not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of a predator that had just made a kill. He looked down, his expression unreadable. He ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed hair, his mind already shifting from the act itself to the performance that must now begin. He smoothed his jacket, composed his face into a mask of shock and horror, and then let out a gut-wrenching cry. "Catherine!" His shout was a masterpiece of fabricated despair. He thundered down the stairs, carefully sidestepping his wife's body, and discovered her. He dropped to his knees beside her, his movements theatrical. "Oh my God, no, Kate. Baby, can you hear me?" He touched her cheek, recoiling as if her skin were on fire. He looked up at Vanessa, his eyes wide with feigned panic. "Call 911 now." Vanessa, playing her part, fumbled for her phone with hands that were perfectly steady. Her voice when she spoke to the dispatcher was a pitch-perfect imitation of a frantic witness. "Yes, my friend." She fell. "She's pregnant." "Oh God, there's so much. Please hurry. We're at 740 Park Avenue, the penthouse." While she was on the phone, Richard began the second phase of his plan, contaminating the scene under the guise of rendering aid. He gently cradled Catherine's head, his fingers subtly wiping away any potential trace evidence he might have left on her shoulders. He pulled her dress down, adjusting it to seem more like a tragic, awkward fall, rather than a violent push. Every touch was calculated, every movement designed to obscure the truth. The wail of sirens grew from a distant cry to an overwhelming roar that filled the opulent street below. Within minutes, the penthouse, usually a sanctuary of quiet wealth, was swarming with the urgent, chaotic energy of paramedics and police officers. The paramedics descended on Catherine's still form, their movements efficient and professional. They cut away the expensive silk dress, attached a neck brace, and began calling out medical jargon that was a foreign language in this world of finance and luxury. No response to verbal or painful stimuli. BP is dropping. Possible severe head trauma and internal bleeding. Richard hovered over them, the picture of a distraught husband. Is she okay? What about the baby? You have to save the baby, he wailed, allowing real tears born of stress and not grief to stream down his face. As the paramedics worked, 2 uniformed officers began to secure the scene. They were soon joined by a man in a rumpled trench coat who moved with a quiet authority that set him apart. Detective Michael Corrigan of the 19th Precinct had the weary eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the city, from its grimiest alleys to its most gilded cages. He knew that tragedy didn't discriminate by zip code, but that wealth often complicated the truth. Corrigan's eyes swept the scene, taking it all in. The magnificent staircase, the victim, heavily pregnant, being loaded onto a gurney, the shattered champagne flute near the bottom of the stairs, which struck him as odd. Who carries a champagne flute while walking down a staircase? He looked at the distraught husband, Richard Sterling, a man he recognized from the papers, and he looked at the other woman, Vanessa Croft, who was standing by the window, looking pale and shaken, but whose eyes, Corrigan noted, were perfectly dry. "I'm Detective Corrigan," he said, his voice a low gravel. "Can one of you tell me what happened?" Richard launched into his rehearsed story, his voice choked with sobs. We were talking, at the top of the stairs. She was upset. Hormonal, you know. She turned too fast. Her heel caught, and she just tumbled. It was so fast. I tried to grab her, but I missed." He held out a hand, showing the detective imaginary scrapes on his knuckles. Corrigan listened, his expression neutral. He'd heard 1,000 stories in his career. Some were true, most were not. "And you are, ma'am?" he asked, turning his attention to Vanessa. "Vanessa Croft," she said, her voice a little too steady. "I'm a colleague of Richard's. I was just leaving when it happened. It was exactly as he said, a terrible, tragic accident." Corrigan nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before returning to the scene. He walked to the bottom of the stairs, crouching down to look at the marble floor. He saw the smallest smear of blood, the scuff marks, the general chaos. But his cop's intuition, a finely honed instrument of skepticism, was buzzing. An accidental fall possible. But the sheer height and the brutality of the injuries felt excessive. It felt angry. As the paramedics wheeled Catherine out her face, pale and still a breathing tube down her throat, Richard made a show of trying to follow. "I have to be with her." Corrigan put a gentle but firm hand on his arm. "Sir, they need to work. We need your statement here while it's fresh. We'll get you to the hospital as soon as we're done." It was a standard procedure, but also a test. A truly distraught husband would fight him. Richard, after a moment of performative resistance, acquiesced. That was the first red flag. The penthouse was now a crime scene. Forensic teams began their methodical work, dusting for prints, taking photographs and collecting fibers. Corrigan led Richard and Vanessa to a sitting room, a cold, impersonal space with white leather couches. He interviewed them separately. Richard's story was polished, full of emotional detail about their love, their excitement for the baby, and Catherine's supposed recent instability. He painted a picture of a fragile, emotional pregnant woman prone to dizzy spells. Vanessa's story was a perfect echo of Richard's, a clean, concise corroboration. She added a touch of sorrow, mentioning how excited Catherine had seemed just hours earlier. It was almost too perfect. But Corrigan found the chinks in the armour. A housekeeper interviewed briefly before being sent home mentioned that Mrs. Sterling never wore heels in the house, especially not now that she was pregnant. She always wore a specific brand of expensive, comfortable flats. Yet a single stiletto-heeled shoe lay on the landing halfway up the stairs, as if placed there. The other was nowhere to be found. Furthermore, a patrol officer noted something to Corrigan. "Detective, look at the husband's watch. It's a high-end smart watch, but the screen is cracked." Corrigan approached Richard again. "Mr. Sterling, what happened to your watch?" Richard looked down, feigning surprise. "Oh my God, it must have happened when I fell to my knees beside her. I didn't even notice." It was a plausible lie, but Corrigan knew those watches were built to be tough. A crack like that required a significant direct impact, an impact like, perhaps, striking something or someone with force. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the city, Detective Corrigan stood by the window of the penthouse, looking down at the awakening metropolis. He had a victim in critical condition at New York Presbyterian, a baby's life hanging in the balance, a powerful grieving husband, and a cool-as-ice witness. Everything on the surface screamed accident, but every instinct in his gut screamed murder. He didn't have proof, he didn't have a motive, but he had a deep, gnawing suspicion, and for Michael Corrigan, that was always the beginning. The truth was in this penthouse somewhere, and he was going to tear the place apart until he found it. The days that followed the fall were a carefully orchestrated performance by Richard Sterling. He was the very image of the grieving husband, maintaining a constant vigil at the hospital, his face etched with worry for the reporters who camped outside. He gave a tearful interview to a local news station, his voice cracking, as he asked for prayers for his beloved Kate and their unborn son. He received an outpouring of public sympathy. Flowers and condolence cards flooded the hospital lobby. To the world, Richard Sterling was a man suffering an unimaginable tragedy. Detective Michael Corrigan wasn't buying it. He saw the performance for what it was, a smoke screen. At the 19th Precinct, he and his team began to systematically deconstruct the narrative Richard had so carefully built. The investigation was a quiet, methodical grind, a search for the one loose thread that would unravel the entire tapestry of lies. "Let's start with the motive," Corrigan said to his team standing in front of a whiteboard, covered with photos of the penthouse, Catherine, Richard, and Vanessa. He says they were happy. Let's find out how happy they really were. They dug into the Sterlings' lives, and what they found was a far cry from the perfect marriage portrayed in the media. Financial records showed that Catherine, once an independent woman with her own career, had become completely dependent on Richard. Her personal bank account had been closed, and she was given a credit card with a strict limit, every charge of which was emailed directly to Richard's personal account. It wasn't the behavior of a trusting husband. It was the behavior of a controller. Then they spoke to Jessica Riley. Catherine's best friend arrived at the precinct, her eyes red-rimmed and blazing with a fury that Corrigan found refreshing after Richard's crocodile tears. "Accident, that's garbage." She spat, her voice trembling with rage. Richard was a monster, a possessive, manipulative sociopath who had Kate trapped in that glass tower he calls a home. She was terrified of him. She called me 2 weeks ago from a burner phone she kept hidden in a shoebox. This was the break Corrigan had been looking for. A burner phone. Yes, Jessica said, pulling a slip of paper from her purse. She gave me the number just in case. She said he tracked her real phone, read her texts, listened to her calls. She was planning to leave him. She was just waiting until the baby was born. She knew the prenup was a trap. Jessica's testimony blew the case wide open. It provided the one thing Corrigan had been missing, a clear and powerful motive. The prenuptial agreement was pulled and examined by the DA's office. It was exactly as Jessica described. A divorce before the birth of the heir meant Catherine walked away with next to nothing. After the birth, she was set for life, and so was her child. Richard didn't want a divorce. He wanted an erasure of his entire marital and financial obligation. Killing Catherine before the baby was born would solve everything. If the baby died too, it was a clean slate. With this new information, Corrigan's team doubled down. They executed a warrant to search the penthouse again, this time with a fine-toothed comb. They were looking for the burner phone for any evidence of Catherine's plan to leave. They didn't find the phone, but the forensics team found something else, something Richard and Vanessa had overlooked in their arrogance. The penthouse was a smart home, controlled by a sophisticated network of voice-activated assistants, speakers, and security cameras. Richard controlled the system, and he believed he had deleted all relevant data from the cloud servers. He had manually turned off the main security cameras in the foyer just before the party sighting, privacy for our guests. But he had missed one thing: a small, unassuming smart speaker on a console table in the living area, just out of sight of the staircase, but within clear earshot. A tech-savvy detective on Corrigan's team managed to access the device's buffered audio recordings from the cloud fragments of sound the system stored temporarily before overwriting. They sifted through hours of party chatter and clinking glasses until they found it, the audio from the moments leading up to the fall. The sound quality was slightly muffled, but the words were chillingly clear. Catherine. I know about the phone, Richard. I know about Vanessa. Richard. So you've been snooping. How disappointing. Catherine. I want a divorce. Richard, laughing. Don't be stupid, Catherine. Read your prenup. Catherine. I have, and I know that changes once our son is born. There was a pause. Then a new voice, female, cold and clear. Vanessa, she knows. You have to handle it, Richard. Now. Richard, you're right. We can't have that. Can we? The audio captured the sound of footsteps, a muffled plea from Catherine, and then a sickening thud followed by a series of horrific percussive impacts. It was all there. Conspiracy and murder captured in a disembodied digital echo. We've got them, Corrigan said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. Simultaneously, the medical reports came back. Catherine's injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. The coroner noted the presence of deep, symmetrical bruising on her upper shoulders, the kind left by fingers gripping and pushing with immense force. The crack on Richard's smartwatch was also analyzed. Microscopic fibers embedded in the cracked glass were a perfect match for the silk dress Catherine had been wearing. He hadn't cracked it by falling to his knees. He had cracked it when his arm swung forward, pushing her into the void. Corrigan now had a motive, a timeline, physical evidence, and a recording of the crime itself. He had Richard Sterling and Vanessa Croft dead to rights. He felt the familiar cold thrill of a case locking into place. All he needed now was his star witness. But she was lying in a hospital bed, lost to the world a machine, breathing for her. He paid a visit to the hospital, standing outside Catherine's room in the ICU. He watched through the glass as Richard sat by her bedside, holding her hand, his face a perfect mask of grief for the nurses to see. He was whispering to her, and Corrigan strained to see the words he was mouthing. Just die. Please just die. The doctor's prognosis was grim. Catherine had suffered severe traumatic brain injury. If she ever woke up, she would likely have significant memory loss, if she could function at all. The baby, however, was a fighter. He was still viable, his heartbeat strong, monitored constantly by the neonatal team. He was a ticking clock. As long as that baby was alive and unborn, Richard's problem wasn't solved. Corrigan knew he had enough to arrest them. The DA was confident. But a jury could be swayed by a high-priced defense attorney who could paint the audio as ambiguous and the evidence as circumstantial. The one thing that would make the case airtight, the one thing that would guarantee a conviction, was for Catherine Sterling to wake up and point her finger at the man holding her hand. As he stood there, watching the predator comfort his prey, Corrigan made a vow. He would get justice for her, whether she woke up or not. But dear God, he hoped she would wake up. The city was sympathizing with a monster, and only Catherine held the power to show them his true face. The world returned to Catherine, not in a rush, but in whispers. For what felt like an eternity, she had been adrift in a thick, soundless fog, a place without thought or feeling. Then slowly sensations began to bleed through the grey. The rhythmic, metronomic beep of a machine, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the scratch of a tube in her throat, the dull, throbbing ache that seemed to emanate from every bone in her body. Sounds resolved into voices, distant and muffled at first, like voices heard from underwater. A kind female voice explaining medical terms she couldn't grasp. A deeper male voice offering a grim prognosis. But it was another voice, a familiar voice, that finally sliced through the fog and pulled her towards the surface. It was Richard's. "Oh, no change, Doctor. You're telling me she could stay like this for weeks, months." His voice was tight with an anxiety that Catherine, even in her semi-conscious state, recognized not as concern, but as impatience. "Mr. Sterling, your wife, has suffered a massive trauma," the doctor's voice replied, tinged with professional sympathy. "We need to be realistic. The best we can do is wait and hope." Wait and hope. The words echoed in the emerging clarity of Catherine's mind. She fought to open her eyes, but her lids felt as if they were sealed with lead. She tried to move a finger to make any sign that she was there, that she could hear them. But her body was a useless prison. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise within her. Days bled into one another in a haze of pain and frustrating paralysis. She learned to distinguish the nurses' shifts by their voices and the feel of their hands. She felt the cold gel on her stomach for the ultrasound, her heart soaring when she heard the strong, steady thump, thump, thump of her son's heartbeat. He was alive. The thought was a lifeline, a reason to fight her way out of the darkness. She also learned to recognize the change in the room's atmosphere when Richard arrived. The nurses would become more deferential, their voices softer. Richard would play his part, his voice full of feigned love and sorrow. "I'm right here, Kate. I'm not leaving you." But his touch was cold. His hand resting on hers felt heavy and dead. The turning point came one late afternoon. She had been drifting half-aware when the door to her private room opened. She expected a nurse, but the scent that entered the room was sharp and familiar. Jasmine. Vanessa. "Any change?" Vanessa's voice was a low, clipped whisper. "Nothing," Richard replied, his voice a tired sigh. "She just lies there. And the damned baby is still fine, according to the doctors. It's like he's thriving in there." "This is taking too long, Richard," Vanessa said, her voice sharp with impatience. "The police are still sniffing around. That Detective Corrigan called my office again today, asking more questions." They're looking at the financials. They're looking at our phone records. Let them look, Richard snapped. There's nothing to find. We were careful. Were we? What if she wakes up? What if she remembers? There was a long silence. Catherine strained with every fibre of her being, forcing her mind to focus to absorb every word. She won't, Richard finally said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. And even if she did, who would they believe? A confused, brain-damaged woman or the loving husband who has been by her side every single day? I've laid the groundwork, Vanessa. The world sees a tragedy. Her instability, her dizzy spells. It's my word against a ghost's. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was a venomous hiss that made Catherine's blood run cold. But this needs to end. If she doesn't expire on her own soon, we may need to consider a more permanent solution. The doctors are talking about compassionate care, about difficult decisions. It would be so easy to be the grieving husband who has to let her go. A wave of pure, undiluted terror washed over Catherine, so powerful it was like a physical blow. They were talking about murdering her. Here in her hospital bed, they were waiting for her to die, and if she didn't, they would finish the job. But alongside the terror, something else ignited within her, a core of rage as hot and bright as a furnace. They had tried to kill her. They had tried to kill her son, and they were going to get away with it, hiding behind a wall of money and lies. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. You will not win. That rage gave her strength. It was a potent fuel burning away the last of the fog. With a monumental effort that took every ounce of her will, she forced her eyelids to flutter. The light was a searing pain, and she squeezed them shut again. She tried again, slower this time. The sterile white ceiling of the hospital room swam into focus. She heard a sharp intake of breath. Her eyes, a nurse's voice said, full of excitement. She's opening her eyes, doctor. Get the doctor. The room was suddenly filled with activity. She felt hands on her, a light shining in her pupils. The doctor's face appeared above hers, kind and smiling. Catherine, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. She felt his hand in hers, and she squeezed a weak, feeble movement that felt like lifting a mountain. A wave of relieved chatter went through the room. Richard pushed his way to her bedside, his face a mask of astonished joy. Kate, oh my God, you're back! You're back with me! He reached for her, but as he came into her line of sight, the memory of his face at the top of the stairs, the cold resolve, the cruel smile flashed in her mind with perfect, horrifying clarity. She remembered the push. She remembered everything. The terror returned, and with it, a primal, instinctual cunning. If he knew she remembered she was dead, her son was dead, he would find a way to silence her. An overdose of morphine, a pillow over her face in the dead of night. He had said it himself, it would be her word against his. She had one chance, one weapon. The doctor was speaking to her again. Catherine, do you know where you are? Do you know what happened? She looked at Richard's hopeful, terrified face. She looked at the doctor. She let her eyes glaze over with a look of utter heart-breaking confusion. She opened her mouth, the tube gone now, her throat raw. Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper. Who are you? She asked, her gaze sweeping over Richard, as if he were a complete stranger. Where am I? I don't remember anything. She saw the flicker of relief in Richard's eyes so quick that anyone else would have missed it. It was quickly replaced by a performance of profound sadness. He sagged, putting a hand to his forehead. Oh, Catherine, he said, his voice breaking. It's me, Richard, your husband. You had a terrible fall." The doctor put a comforting hand on Richard's shoulder. "It's not uncommon with this level of head trauma," he explained gently. "Amnesia. It could be temporary, or it could be more extensive. We'll have to run some tests." Catherine lay perfectly still, her heart hammering in her chest. The game had just changed. She wasn't a helpless victim anymore. She was a hunter, hiding in plain sight. From this hospital bed, feigning weakness and memory loss, she would become their worst nightmare. She would let them believe they were safe, let them drop their guard. And she would gather everything she needed to destroy them, for herself and for the son who was still fighting for his life inside her. The diagnosis of retrograde amnesia was Richard's salvation. He threw himself into the role of the devoted, heartbroken husband, nursing his wife back from the brink. He brought in photo albums regaling the doctors and nurses with fabricated stories of their whirlwind romance. He sat by her bed for hours, reminiscing about a life that was a carefully edited fiction, all while Catherine watched him from behind a mask of vacant confusion. It was the most terrifying and exhausting performance of her life. Every gentle touch from him made her skin crawl. Every loving word felt like a razor blade against her soul. But she played her part flawlessly. She was a blank slate, a fragile, frightened woman trying to piece together a life she couldn't remember. She would ask him simple questions. Did we have a favorite restaurant? Did I like the color blue? And watch his face, studying the micro-expressions of relief and smug satisfaction. He thought he was in control. He thought he had won. He had no idea he was a fly caught in a web he couldn't see. Her only true ally was Jessica. When Jessica first visited the reunion, was agonizing. Seeing the genuine love and terror in her friend's eyes, Catherine wanted to break down and tell her everything. But Richard was there watching, so she had to treat Jessica like a kind stranger. "This is Jessica," Richard had said, his arm possessively around Catherine's shoulders. "Your best friend, since college." Catherine had looked at Jessica with wide, empty eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, a genuine tear of frustration and grief slipping down her cheek. "I don't—" Jessica's face crumpled, but she quickly composed herself, understanding instinctively that something was wrong. She played along, reintroducing herself, talking about light, simple memories. But as she leaned in for a hug, her mouth next to Catherine's ear, she whispered 4 critical words. "I don't believe him." That was all Catherine needed. Her next move was risky. During a medical examination when Richard was forced to wait outside, Catherine scribbled a frantic, shaky note on a piece of paper from the lunch tray and slipped it into the pocket of a friendly young nurse named Maria, who Richard often dismissed with arrogant disdain. The note was simple. "Give this to Jessica Riley. Tell no one." The note read, "I remember everything. He pushed me. Amnesia is a lie to stay alive. Need help. Get word to Detective Corrigan." The next day, Jessica returned her demeanor outwardly, the same, but with a new intensity in her eyes. While Richard was on a business call in the hallway, Jessica helped Catherine adjust her pillows. As she did, she slipped a tiny object into Catherine's hand, a burner phone, no bigger than a credit card, and a slip of paper with a number on it. "Corrigan's direct line," she breathed. "The nurse Maria is a friend of my cousin. She's on our side. She'll cover for you during her shifts." A lifeline. That night, with Maria standing guard at the door, Catherine made the call. Her voice was a low, urgent whisper as she told Detective Corrigan everything. To push the conversation she overheard between Richard and Vanessa, and her current deception. On the other end of the line, Corrigan listened, a cold fury building inside him. He had the audio, the forensics, the motive, but this was the final devastating piece, a living witness. "Okay, Catherine," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "You are doing something incredibly brave, but you need to stay safe. Do not let them suspect for a second. We're coming for them. But I want to nail them to the wall so they never see the light of day again. To do that, I need your help. We have the audio of them talking before the fall, but his lawyers will say it's out of context. We need something more. Something that shows clear intent. Something recent." Catherine's mind raced. "His laptop," she whispered. "He brings it here every day. He thinks I'm practically a vegetable. He works for hours. All his business, his entire life is on that laptop. And on his phone. Can you get access?" Corrigan asked. "He leaves the room sometimes to talk to doctors or take calls," Catherine said, a plan forming in her mind. "But it's password protected. I don't know the password." "Try his ego," Corrigan suggested. "His birthday, his company's name, something he's proud of." The next afternoon, the opportunity came. Richard was in the room typing furiously on his sleek silver laptop. A specialist came in to discuss Catherine's physical therapy schedule, and Richard stepped out into the hall, leaving the laptop open on the bedside table. Catherine's heart pounded. This was it. Her hands trembled as she reached for the machine. The screen was locked, demanding a password. She took a deep breath and thought like Richard. What was the most important thing in the world to him? Himself. His legacy. She typed in the name of his first, highly successful hedge fund, a name he mentioned constantly in his reminiscing Sterling Alpha Wong. The screen unlocked. She was in. A wave of triumphant adrenaline surged through her. She didn't have much time. Following Corrigan's whispered instructions from the night before, she ignored the documents and emails. She was looking for one thing. She found the search history in his web browser. Her blood ran cold as she read the recent entries. How to override hospital life support systems. Potassium chloride dosage lethal. Does a will become void if a spouse is institutionalized? Best criminal defense attorneys, New York City. Countries with no extradition treaty with the US. It was a step-by-step guide to her murder and his escape. He wasn't just waiting for her to die. He was actively researching how to make it happen. Using the tiny burner phone, she quickly and quietly took pictures of the screen, her hands shaking so badly she had to take each one twice. She navigated to his cloud storage, a drive filled with encrypted folders. One, however, was labeled simply Contingency. The password was the same. Inside was a single audio file. She clicked play, keeping the volume at a barely audible whisper. It was Vanessa's voice, recorded days after the fall. Getting sloppy, Richard. Leaving a search history like that. Delete everything. If she wakes up, or if the police find that we're finished. I've transferred the funds to the offshore account as we discussed. If this goes south, we disappear. But you better be sure you handle your wife first. He was recording her. The sociopath was keeping an insurance policy against his own partner. Catherine quickly emailed the audio file and the photos to a secure address Corrigan had given her. Just as she hit send and closed the laptop, she heard Richard's footsteps approaching. She dropped the phone under her blankets and slumped back against the pillows, her eyes vacant, her breathing shallow, just as he walked back into the room. He glanced at the laptop, then at her. For a terrifying second, she thought he knew. His eyes narrowed, searching her face for any sign of deception. But he saw only the weak, memory-wiped victim he had created. His expression softened into his familiar, condescending smile. "Tired, my love?" he asked, closing the laptop. "Just rest. Everything is going to be taken care of very soon." "Yes," Catherine thought as she closed her eyes, a silent, grim promise to her unborn son. It certainly is. Detective Corrigan felt a surge of cold, righteous fury as he looked at the evidence Catherine had sent him. The search history was a confession. The audio file of Vanessa was the nail in the coffin. It was premeditated. It was ruthless, and it was all there in black and white. There would be no high-priced lawyer wriggling them out of this. He assembled his team. "It's time," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "We're taking them both down. Now." The plan was executed with swift, quiet precision. One team of detectives was dispatched to the Sterling Capital headquarters in Midtown to apprehend Vanessa Croft. Another team, led by Corrigan himself, headed for New York Presbyterian Hospital. Vanessa was in a glass-walled boardroom, leading a meeting when the detectives entered. She looked up, her expression of annoyance quickly morphing into one of shock as she saw the badges. "Vanessa Croft," one of the detectives asked, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and attempted murder." The color drained from her face. Her mask of cool superiority shattered, replaced by raw panic. "This is absurd. You have no idea who you're dealing with," she snarled as they cuffed her hands behind her back. But as she was led away through the stunned silence of her colleagues, her eyes betrayed a dawning horror. Richard had failed. He hadn't silenced Catherine, and now they were both going down. At the hospital, Corrigan wanted to handle Richard himself. He entered the ICU ward, flanked by 2 uniformed officers, and found Richard right where he expected him to be, by Catherine's bedside, holding her hand, the picture of devotion. A nurse was checking Catherine's vitals. "Mr. Sterling." Corrigan said, his voice calm and even. Richard looked up, forcing a weary smile. "Detective, any news?" "As a matter of fact, yes," Corrigan said, stepping closer. "Richard Sterling, you are under arrest for the attempted murder of your wife, Catherine Sterling, and her unborn child." Richard's smile froze. He laughed, a short, incredulous bark. "You can't be serious. On what grounds? My wife had an accident." "We know about the push, Richard," Corrigan said, his voice dropping. "We know about the prenup. We know about your research into potassium chloride dosages. And we know about your contingency plan." As Corrigan spoke, he saw Richard's eyes dart towards Catherine. He saw the flicker of confusion, the dawning realization that he had been played. And then he looked back at Corrigan, with pure, undiluted hatred. At that moment, Catherine's eyes, which had been vacant for weeks, slowly focused. They moved from the detective to the man holding her hand. Her expression shifted from confusion to one of clear, profound recognition, and of terror. "You," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. She pulled her hand from his as if it had been burned. "You pushed me." The nurse gasped. The uniformed officers stepped forward. Richard stared at his wife, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The amnesia had been a trick. The fragile, broken victim was a lie. He had been living in a cage with a predator, and never even knew it. He lunged not for the door, but for Catherine, a final, desperate act of violence. "You lying bitch!" he roared. But Corrigan was faster. He intercepted Richard, slamming him back against the wall with a force that knocked the breath from him. The officers swarmed, wrenching his arms behind his back and snapping the cold steel of the handcuffs around his wrists. "It's over, Sterling," Corrigan growled in his ear. As they dragged him, struggling and cursing from the room, Richard's eyes locked with Catherine's one last time. He saw no fear in her gaze anymore, only a cold, hard strength he had never known she possessed. She had beaten him. In the weeks that followed, the story exploded across the news. The tale of the millionaire, the mistress, and the wife who outsmarted them both was on every screen. Faced with the mountain of evidence and Catherine's impending testimony, Vanessa Croft's resolve crumbled. In exchange for a lesser sentence, she confessed to everything, detailing Richard's entire plan from the beginning. She painted him as the manipulative monster he was, and in doing so sealed his fate. 3 weeks later, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Andrew, meaning strong and brave. Holding him in her arms in the quiet of her hospital room, far from the media circus, she felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had walked through fire and emerged not just a survivor, but a warrior. She had saved herself, and she had saved her son. The gilded cage was gone, and in its place was the terrifying, beautiful, and boundless freedom of a future she would build for them on her own terms. The sterling fortune tied up in legal battles didn't matter. She had the only thing of value, her son, her life, and her strength. In the end, Richard Sterling, the Titan of Wall Street, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His empire crumbled, his name becoming a byword for greed and cruelty. Vanessa Croft, his co-conspirator, received a 25-year sentence, her ambition leading her to a cold, concrete cell. But this story isn't just about their downfall. It's about the incredible resilience of Catherine Sterling, a woman who was pushed broken and left for dead, but who refused to be a victim. She used her attacker's own arrogance against him, turning her hospital bed into a command center for justice. Her story is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength is often found in our darkest moments, and that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet whisper in the dark, vowing to see the sunrise. If Catherine's incredible story of survival and justice moved you, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the power of the human spirit, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that will leave you breathless. Click the notification bell so you never miss an update.